It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Julian laughed as he slid a coaster under Arthur's glass, treating the legendary architect like a senile child. The sound of heavy crystal hitting the mahogany table echoed through the dining room, drawing the attention of the city's most influential developers. Arthur Sterling sat motionless, his spine as straight as the load-bearing columns of the skyscrapers he had once designed. He didn't reach for the glass. He simply watched his son. The air in the Sterling mansion smelled of expensive cedarwood and Julian's cloying, spiced amber cologne. It was the scent of a man who bought his way into rooms he hadn't earned the right to stand in. Julian leaned back, adjusting his silk tie, his eyes gleaming with a predatory arrogance. "You'll have to excuse my father," Julian said, his voice carrying effortlessly to the other end of the table where the investors sat. "He's been a bit forgetful lately. The doctor says it's the onset of cognitive decline. He forgets where he puts things, deeds, signatures, even his own professional legacy." A low murmur of feigned sympathy rippled through the guests. Arthur felt the weight of their gaze, a mixture of pity and calculated dismissal. He looked toward the head of the table, where Beatrice Sterling sat. She was draped in diamonds that Arthur's hard work had paid for, her expression a mask of practiced concern. "It's been so difficult," Beatrice added, her voice a sharp contrast to the warmth she pretended to offer. She reached over, patting Arthur's hand with a touch as cold as a marble grave. "Arthur Sterling was a titan once, but even titans crumble. We're just trying to make sure the Sterling name survives the erosion." Arthur didn't pull his hand away. He let her touch him, observing the way her eyes darted to Julian. They were already spending his ghost's fortune. He looked past them to the corner of the room, where his granddaughter, Cassie, stood. Her face was pale, her knuckles white as she gripped the back of a chair. She was the only one in the room who saw the cruelty for what it was. She knew her grandfather's mind was still a steel trap, but she was too young, too frightened of her father to speak. Julian took a long sip of his vintage Bordeaux. "That's why I've taken over the Sterling Heights project. It needs a modern touch, not the dusty, over-engineered blueprints of a man who still thinks in T-squares and ink." He chuckled, looking at the lead investor. "Dad actually tried to tell me the foundation on the East Wing was unstable. Can you imagine? The man can't remember what he had for breakfast, but he wants to lecture me on structural integrity." The table erupted in polite, mocking laughter. Arthur felt a familiar sensation, not rage, but the cold, analytical focus he used when a design failed a stress test. He saw the cracks in the room. He saw the way the investors looked at Julian, not with respect, but with the hunger of sharks sensing blood in the water. Julian was a failure who had convinced himself he was a king, and Beatrice was the architect of the lie. Arthur's hand moved slowly toward the inner pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. He felt the crisp edge of a heavy vellum envelope. Inside wasn't a doctor's report, but a private structural audit he had commissioned weeks ago. He also felt the small, cold vibration of his phone against his hip. He didn't pull the envelope out. Not yet. "Julian," Arthur said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that cut through the laughter like a saw through soft pine. The table went silent. It was the first time he had spoken all evening. Julian smirked, swirling his wine. "Yes, Dad. Did you remember where you left your slippers?" "I remembered something much more important," Arthur replied, his eyes locking onto his son's with a clarity that made Julian's smirk falter for a fraction of a second. "I remembered that a building is only as strong as the ground it stands on. If the soil is sour, the whole structure is destined to fall. No matter how much gold leaf you slap on the facade." Beatrice's smile tightened. "Arthur, dear, you're rambling again. Perhaps it's time for your evening medication." "I've never been clearer, Beatrice," Arthur said. He turned his gaze to the investors. "My son is right about one thing. The Sterling name is about to undergo a massive transformation." He reached under the table and tapped a preset command on his phone. A mile away, in a darkened office, Detective Elias Thorne received the signal. The first of the digital breadcrumbs, the records of Julian's embezzled funds and Beatrice's forged medical documents, began their silent journey toward a secure server. Julian let out a sharp, annoyed huff. "Enough of this. Someone get the nurse. He's having one of his episodes." Arthur stood up. He didn't use the table for support. He stood with the effortless grace of a man who had spent 40 years climbing scaffolding. He looked at the room full of people who had already written his obituary. "Enjoy the wine, Julian," Arthur said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's a 1945 Rothschild. It was bottled the year the war ended. A fitting choice for a night like tonight." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked toward the foyer, his footsteps rhythmic and steady on the marble floor. Behind him, he heard Julian's voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control of the room, but the tone was higher, thinner. As Arthur reached the front door, he paused. He looked at the heavy oak portal, a masterpiece he had designed himself. He touched the grain of the wood, feeling the solid reality of it. He wasn't the senile old man they wanted him to be. He was the man who knew exactly where the demolition charges needed to be placed. His phone buzzed in his hand. A text from Elias, "The audit is live. The judge is waiting for the hard copies. Are you sure about this, Arthur? There's no turning back once the foundation is blown." Arthur looked back at the house that had become a cage of gaslighting and greed. He thought of Cassie's frightened eyes and Julian's mocking laugh. He typed back a single word: demolish. Arthur stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The countdown had begun, and Julian Sterling had no idea that he was standing directly at ground zero. The next morning, the Sterling estate felt less like a home and more like a tomb draped in expensive velvet. Arthur Sterling moved through the hallway, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs he had purchased in Isfahan 30 years ago. He felt the weight of the house, the structural integrity he had personally verified, the hidden load-bearing beams, the secrets tucked behind the wainscoting. In the breakfast nook, the scent of over-roasted espresso and Beatrice Sterling's cloying lavender perfume hung heavy in the air. Julian Sterling sat at the head of the table, a position he hadn't earned, but occupied with the practiced ease of a squatter. He didn't look up from his tablet as Arthur entered the room. The sharp, rhythmic clatter of silver against fine bone china was the only greeting. "You're late for your meds, Dad," Julian said, his voice flat, devoid of any real concern. He finally looked up, his eyes scanning Arthur with a clinical coldness that made the older man's skin crawl. "Beatrice says you wandered off again last night. Into the garden, in the damp air. That's how the confusion starts." Beatrice reached out, her fingers, manicured to lethal points, sliding a small white porcelain cup toward Arthur. Inside sat a single blue capsule. "It's for the tremors, dear. You were shaking so badly yesterday when you tried to sign those trust documents. We can't have you hurting yourself." Arthur sat down, his hands steady beneath the tablecloth. He palmed the pill with the practiced grace of a stage magician, tucked it into the hidden fold of his silk robe, and replaced the movement with a scripted, fragile tremor. He watched Beatrice smile, a thin, predatory expression that never reached her eyes. She thought she was winning. She thought the chemical fog was finally thick enough to obscure the exit. "The Sterling Foundation Gala is in 3 days," Julian said, tapping a rhythm on the table with a heavy gold ring. "I've invited the board. We're going to announce your retirement and my transition to chairman. It's a graceful exit, Arthur. People will remember the architect, not the man who forgets his own middle name." Arthur took a slow sip of water, the coldness of the glass a sharp anchor to reality. "The foundation," he murmured, his voice intentionally raspy. "That's a lot of responsibility, Julian. Are you sure the foundation is solid?" Julian let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "The only thing that isn't solid in this house is your memory. I've already cleared the transition with the legal team. All we need is your public endorsement at the podium. Don't worry, Beatrice has written a script for you. Very simple." Large font. Arthur looked past his son to the doorway, where Cassie Sterling stood. The teenager looked pale, her eyes darting between her father's arrogance and her grandfather's feigned frailty. She saw the brochure for the memory care facility tucked under Julian's tablet, the one with St. Jude's embossed in silver. Her lower lip trembled, a flash of genuine pain that cut through Arthur's calculated coldness. She was the only thing in this house worth saving from the wreckage. "I'll be there," Arthur said softly. "Good," Julian snapped, standing up and smoothing his tailored suit. He looked at Arthur as if he were a piece of furniture that had outlived its aesthetic value. "Try not to stain your shirt before then. We have a reputation to maintain, even if you've forgotten what it's for." Julian and Beatrice swept out of the room, their voices rising in a hushed, excited argument about the guest list and the expected inheritance tax. They didn't notice Arthur reach into his pocket and pull out a small, high-fidelity recording device Elias had provided. He pressed the stop button, the red light flickering out like a dying ember. He looked at Cassie, who remained in the shadows of the hallway. He didn't speak, but he allowed his posture to straighten, just for a second. The tremor in his hand vanished. He reached out and touched the heavy oak table, the table Julian thought he owned. Julian didn't know that the Sterling Foundation wasn't a charity. It was a legal labyrinth, and Arthur was the only one who held the blueprints to the exit. His phone vibrated in his robe. A message from Detective Elias Thorne. "Audit stage 1 complete. They've moved $4 million into the offshore shell. It's a paper trail a mile wide. The judge is briefed. 3 days, Arthur." Arthur looked out the window at the manicured lawn. The countdown wasn't just for the gala. It was for the moment the Sterling name stopped being a shield for Julian and started being a noose. He had 3 days to ensure that when the house fell, it fell exactly where he wanted it to. He turned the blue pill over in his fingers before dropping it into the dregs of Julian's abandoned espresso. The gala was on Thursday. By Friday, Julian Sterling wouldn't have a chair to sit in, let alone a table to lead. Arthur stood, his movements fluid and precise, and walked toward the stairs. He had a script to memorize, but it wasn't the one Beatrice had written. 2 days had vanished into a blur of floral arrangements and forged signatures, leaving the Sterling Manor smelling of industrial floor wax and the cloying, sweet scent of lilies. Arthur Sterling stood on the second-floor landing, his hand resting lightly on the cold mahogany railing. Below, the foyer was a battlefield of preparation. Grandiose gold-leafed invitations sat in stacks on the marble console, each one a summons to a coronation Julian believed was his own. Arthur felt the weight of the manila envelope tucked beneath his arm, the sharp corners pressing against his ribs like a concealed dagger. He moved toward the back staircase, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He had a meeting to keep, one that required the absolute absence of his son's watchful eyes. In the shadows of the converted carriage house, Detective Elias Thorne was waiting. The air here was cooler, smelling of old oil and damp stone, a sharp contrast to the suffocating luxury of the main house. The retired investigator looked up from a tablet, his face etched with the grim satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "The final piece of the bridge is in place, Arthur," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He tapped the screen, showing a digital map of transactions that zigzagged across 3 continents before settling into a shell company registered in Beatrice's maiden name. They didn't just steal the capital, they stripped the pension fund of the development firm to cover the offshore transfer. It's not just fraud anymore. It's a total collapse. Arthur took the tablet, his eyes scanning the numbers with the same precision he once used to calculate the load-bearing capacity of a skyscraper. He saw the structural flaws in their crime, the sloppy overrides, the panicked pace of the transfers. It was a house of cards built on a foundation of pure arrogance. "I've briefed Judge Marcus Vane," Elias continued, leaning back against a workbench. "He's attending the gala as your guest of honor. He's seen the preliminary audit. He told me to tell you that the law has a very long memory for men who bury their fathers before they're dead." "Julian always was impatient," Arthur murmured, handing the tablet back. "He never understood that the most important part of any structure isn't what people see. It's what's buried in the ground. Are you ready for tomorrow?" Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It contained the real blueprints of the Sterling legacy, not the ones Julian had tried to sell off. but the ones Arthur had quietly reclaimed. "The stage is set, Elias. I just have to make sure the actors don't miss their cues." He returned to the main house just as the front doors swung open. Julian Sterling marched in, his face flushed with a frantic, manic energy. He was draped in a bespoke tuxedo jacket, the silk lapels catching the light, a physical manifestation of the wealth he hadn't yet earned. He was followed by two decorators carrying a massive, gilded portrait of himself. "Move that old armchair to the basement," Julian barked at the staff, pointing a finger at the velvet wingback where Arthur spent his mornings. "It's an eyesore. It smells like a nursing home and ancient history. This foyer needs to breathe success, not decay." One of the decorators hesitated, glancing up at Arthur on the landing. Julian didn't even look at his father. He just laughed, a sharp, entitled sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Don't mind the old man. He won't even remember where he usually sits by dinner time. Just get it out of here. My guests are coming to see the future of this family, not its relics." Beatrice Sterling appeared from the dining room, her heels clicking like a metronome on the marble. She held a silver tray with a single glass of water and a small white pill. She looked up and caught Arthur's gaze, her smile a masterpiece of manufactured concern. "There you are, Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with honeyed poison. "You look a bit peaked. The excitement of the gala is clearly taking its toll on your nerves. I've already spoken to the director at Silver Oaks. They have a lovely suite available starting Friday. It's very quiet there. No stairs to worry about." She walked up the steps toward him, the tray steady in her hands. "Take your medicine, dear. We need you to be just coherent enough to stand for the photos tomorrow. After that, you can rest forever." Arthur took the glass, his fingers brushing hers. Her skin was cold, devoid of any genuine warmth. He looked down at the pill, then back at his daughter-in-law. For a fleeting second, the sleeping lion allowed a spark of clarity to flash in his eyes, a predator's look that made Beatrice's smile falter for a heartbeat. "You've thought of everything, Beatrice," Arthur said, his voice steady and terrifyingly calm. "The flowers, the guests, the medicine. It's a shame to see so much effort go into a party that no one will want to remember." He tilted the glass back, faking the swallow with a practiced flick of his throat, while the pill remained tucked securely under his tongue. Beatrice nodded, satisfied, and turned back to Julian to argue about the placement of his portrait. Arthur waited until she was gone before spitting the pill into a nearby potted fern. He looked down at his son, who was currently berating a servant for a smudge on the silver. Julian was standing exactly where the structural tension was highest, oblivious to the fact that the man he had dismissed as a relic had already pulled the pin on the foundation. He saw Cassie Sterling peeking out from the library door, her eyes wide and worried. Arthur gave her a small, secret wink, the only bit of his true self he allowed to surface. "Tomorrow, Cassie," he whispered to the empty hallway. "Tomorrow, the house comes down." The gala was less than 24 hours away. The invitations were out, the judge was briefed, and the $4 million Julian thought was his ticket to freedom was actually the weight that would drown him. Arthur turned and walked toward his room, his mind already calculating the exact moment the first crack would appear in the Sterling name. He didn't need a chair in the foyer. By Friday, Julian wouldn't even have a floor to stand on. The morning of the gala arrived with a deceptive, silver-gray stillness that felt more like a bated breath than a beginning. Arthur Sterling sat in the sun-drenched breakfast nook, his fingers tracing the rim of a porcelain cup. The smell of bitter, over-extracted espresso hung heavy in the air, a sharp contrast to the floral scents Beatrice Sterling had spent the morning arranging throughout the foyer. He watched the steam rise, his mind running through the final stress test calculations of his plan. Julian Sterling entered the kitchen 10 minutes later, his heavy designer loafers clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. He didn't look like a man on the verge of bankruptcy. He looked like a king preparing for a coronation. He poured himself a glass of imported juice, his movements jerky with a manic, caffeine-fueled energy. "Enjoying the quiet, Dad?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with a condescension that had become his default setting. He checked his gold watch, the metal clicking audibly against the stone counter. "It's the last day you'll have to worry about this drafty old mausoleum. Once the ink is dry on the transfer tonight, I'm moving you to that facility in the valley. They have gardens. You like gardens, right?" Arthur didn't look up. He felt the weight of the digital recorder in his robe pocket, a small, cold comfort. "A building is only as strong as the ground it's built on, Julian. If the soil is sour, the whole structure eventually leans." Julian let out a sharp, jagged laugh that grated like sandpaper. "Still talking in blueprints, that's your problem. You spent your life worrying about the bones while I'm looking at the facade. The facade is what sells, Arthur. The facade is what people pay for." He leaned over the table, his shadow falling across his father's plate. "Tonight, I get paid. $4 million is a lot of facade." Beatrice drifted into the room then, her silk robe rustling like a warning. She didn't look at Arthur. She looked through him, her eyes already calculating the social capital she would earn by the evening's end. She adjusted the collar of Julian's shirt with a proprietary flick of her wrist. "The caterers are arriving at noon," she said, her voice cold and precise. "Make sure the relic stays out of the way until the guests arrive. We can't have him wandering around in his slippers when Judge Marcus Vane gets here." Arthur finally met his son's gaze. There was a clarity in his eyes that Julian was too arrogant to recognize as a threat. "I would be careful about what you've built on that $4 million, Julian. Sometimes the weight of the debt is what finally brings the roof down." Julian snorted, turning his back to grab his phone. "You're rambling again. It's sad, really. But don't worry, by tomorrow, your opinions won't be my problem anymore. Just make sure you're in that tuxedo by 7. Try to look like a sterling, even if you've forgotten how to act like one." He swept out of the room, Beatrice trailing behind him like a silent, elegant shadow. They left behind a silence that felt heavy with the scent of ozone before a storm. Arthur stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement, but his resolve was iron. He walked toward the library, catching a glimpse of Cassie Sterling standing in the shadows of the hallway. She was holding a stack of gala programs, her small face pale and set with a premature gravity. She watched her father disappear into the foyer, then turned her gaze to her grandfather. "Is it time?" she whispered. Arthur reached into his pocket and felt the crisp edge of the bank statement Detective Elias Thorne had delivered at midnight, the one showing the systematic draining of the Sterling Trust. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. "The foundation is already cracked, Cassie," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Tonight, we just let the gravity do the work." He retreated into his study, locking the heavy oak door behind him. On his desk lay the final seating chart for the gala. He picked up a pen and made one final adjustment, moving the judge to the head table, directly across from Julian. The trap was set. The countdown had reached its final hour. Tomorrow was no longer a promise, it was an inevitability. The evening of the Sterling Foundation Gala arrived with a biting, rhythmic rain that lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling Plaza. Arthur had traded the heavy silence of his study for the deafening opulence of the grand ballroom, a space he had designed 30 years ago to feel like a cathedral of glass and light. Now, standing on the mezzanine, he felt like a ghost in his own creation. He gripped the cold brass railing, his knuckles white against the metal, and watched the vultures descend. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of forced lilies and expensive floor wax, a combination that always reminded him of a funeral disguised as a party. Julian arrived exactly 20 minutes late, a calculated move designed to ensure the maximum number of eyes were on him when he made his entrance. He moved through the crowd with a predatory swagger, his tuxedo tailored so tightly it looked like armor. Beside him, Beatrice was a vision in ice blue silk, her diamonds catching the light with a clinical, shivering brilliance. They didn't see Arthur at first. They were too busy harvesting the room, shaking hands with donors and leaning in for practiced, toothy photos. When Julian finally ascended the stairs to the mezzanine, he didn't offer a greeting. He simply stopped 2 feet away, invading Arthur's personal space with the casual arrogance of a man who had already measured the casket. He signaled a passing waiter, snatched 2 flutes of vintage champagne, and handed one to his wife without looking at her. "You look tired, Dad," Julian said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the ears of the 3 board members standing nearby. "The lights are a bit much for you, aren't they? Maybe we should have arranged for a private room where you could rest while I handle the heavy lifting tonight." Arthur didn't flinch. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his mineral water, his eyes tracking the way Julian's thumb rubbed restlessly against the stem of his glass, a tell of nervous energy Julian had never been able to shake. "The lights are fine, Julian. I find they have a way of revealing things that prefer to stay in the dark." Beatrice let out a sharp, brittle laugh that sounded like glass breaking in a distant room. She adjusted the lapel of Arthur's jacket, her fingers lingering a second too long near his throat. "Always so cryptic. It's a shame the donors prefer clarity over riddles these days. They want to see the new face of the sterling legacy, not a reminder of how fragile it's become." She turned her back on him before he could respond, pulling Julian toward a group of hedge fund managers. Arthur watched them go, his hand sliding into the inner pocket of his coat. He felt the crisp, sharp corner of the folder Elias had slipped to him in the service hallway 10 minutes earlier. It wasn't just a bank statement anymore. It was a map of every shell company Julian had used to bleed the trust dry. The secret weight of it against his ribs was the only thing keeping him upright. Across the room, near a towering floral arrangement, he spotted Cassie. She looked small and out of place in her velvet dress, her eyes darting toward the doors as if looking for an exit. Julian walked past her, pausing only to pat her head with a patronizing dismissiveness that made Arthur's jaw tighten. He didn't speak to her. He treated her like a piece of furniture he had forgotten to move. The sound of clinking crystal filled the air as the toast drew near. The tension in the room was a living thing, a coiled spring waiting for a reason to snap. Arthur saw Detective Elias Thorne positioned near the security station, his face a mask of professional indifference, but his eyes were locked on Arthur, waiting for the signal. Every piece was on the board. The arrogance in the room was so thick it was almost suffocating, a collective delusion that wealth was a shield against the truth. "He's actually going to do it," a voice whispered beside him. Arthur turned to see Judge Marcus Vane. The older man looked at Julian with a mixture of pity and professional curiosity. "He thinks the announcement tonight is his coronation. He's been telling the committee all week that you're prepared to step down for health reasons." "Is that what he thinks?" Arthur asked, his voice a low, steady rumble. "He's certain of it," the judge replied, his eyes narrowing as he watched Julian take a position near the stage. "He's already drafted the press release. He thinks I'm here to witness his rise." "Then we shouldn't keep him waiting," Arthur said. He felt a strange, cold calm wash over him. The rage that had burned in his chest for months had crystallized into something sharper, something surgical. He looked down at his watch. 5 minutes until the keynote. 5 minutes until Julian stepped onto the stage to claim a kingdom that was already crumbling beneath his feet. Julian began to move toward the podium, adjusting his cufflinks and flashing a winning smile at a row of cameras. He looked invincible. He looked like a man who had never known the weight of a consequence. He stopped at the base of the stairs, turning back to give Beatrice a triumphant wink. He was so caught up in the theater of his own success that he didn't notice the way the room had gone slightly quiet, or the way the security team was slowly shifting their positions toward the exits. Arthur began his descent. He moved slowly, his cane clicking against the marble stairs with the steady, inevitable beat of a metronome. With every step, he felt the power dynamic in the room shifting, though only he could feel the tide turning. Julian was at the microphone now, tapping it to test the sound, the feedback echoing through the cavernous hall like a warning. Julian looked up and saw Arthur approaching the front row. He smirked, leaning into the microphone. "I'd like to thank my father for joining us tonight," he said, his voice booming through the speakers, dripping with a false, oily warmth. "It's rare to see him out of bed these days, but I suppose even the old lions want to see the new king take the throne." A few people chuckled, Beatrice beamed from the front table. Arthur reached his seat and sat down, his face a mask of stone. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked directly at Julian, who was unfolding a speech that Arthur knew would be his last. "The floor is yours, Julian," Arthur said, his voice unamplified but somehow carrying through the sudden silence. "Make sure you say everything you need to say. You won't get a second chance." Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes flickering with a momentary, instinctive fear before his ego slammed the door shut. He cleared his throat, straightened his shoulders, and began to speak. Arthur sat back, his hand resting on the folder in his lap, waiting for the exact moment the foundation would finally give way. Julian Sterling stood at the mahogany podium, the overhead spotlights catching the sharp, expensive sheen of his silk tie. The ballroom of the Sterling Grand was thick with the scent of lilies and floor wax, a sanitized fragrance that masked the underlying tension. He adjusted his cufflinks with a practiced, arrogant flick of his wrists, looking out over the sea of investors and socialites with the grin of a man who believed he had already won. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified and echoing through the hushed hall. "My father, Arthur, has always been a man of the old world," he began, his voice dripping with a condescending warmth that made the bile rise in the back of the elder man's throat. "He believes in slow growth and outdated methods. But today, as I take the helm of Sterling Development, we move into a future of speed, efficiency, and aggressive expansion. I do this not just for the company, but for my daughter, Cassie, to ensure her inheritance is as vast as the skyline we intend to reshape." Arthur sat in the front row, his hand resting on the rough texture of the manila folder in his lap. He felt the cold, metallic weight of the small remote trigger in his pocket. The audacity of his son using his granddaughter's name as a shield for his greed was the final fracture in the foundation. He watched as Beatrice Sterling, seated 2 chairs down, leaned back with a triumphant smirk, her fingers tracing the rim of a crystal flute filled with vintage champagne. She looked like a queen mother awaiting her coronation. "Julian," Arthur said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a structural resonance that cut through his son's polished delivery. The younger man paused, his smile faltering as he peered over the podium. "Not now, Dad. We can discuss your retirement plans later. I know the excitement is a bit much for you." A ripple of cruel laughter moved through the room. Arthur didn't flinch. He simply stood up, the movement slow and deliberate, drawing every eye in the ballroom. He reached into his pocket and pressed the button on the remote. Behind the podium, the massive digital screen, which had been displaying a glossy rendering of Julian's newest high-rise project, flickered. The image of the glass tower vanished, replaced by a jagged, black-and-white scan of a structural integrity report. Red stamps of failed and fraudulent covered the margins. The room went deathly silent, the only sound the low, mechanical hum of the projector fan. Julian's face underwent a violent, silent transformation. The smug, practiced grin he'd worn for the cameras didn't just fade. It curdled. His skin, usually a pampered, healthy tan, drained to a sickly, translucent gray, making the sweat beads on his upper lip glisten like oil under the stage lights. His eyes, once bright with unearned triumph, widened until the whites were visible all the way around the irises, darting frantically between the screen and his father. His jaw didn't just drop, it hung slack, his mouth forming a hollow O that seemed incapable of drawing in enough air. The muscles in his neck corded, twitching with a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor as the realization hit him. The foundation hadn't just cracked, it had vanished. Beatrice's hand froze midair, her wine glass tilting dangerously. The red liquid sloshed against the crystal, reflecting her sudden, sharp-edged terror. Beside her, Judge Marcus Vane leaned forward, his heavy brows knitting together as he adjusted his spectacles to read the fine print on the screen, the signatures Julian had forged, the safety codes he had bypassed, and the offshore accounts used to hide the kickbacks. "What is this?" Judge Vane's voice boomed, turning toward the podium. The board members at the front table recoiled as if the screen were emitting heat, their whispers rising into a frantic, dissonant hum. Across the room, Detective Elias Thorne stood by the exit, his arms crossed, a grim shadow of satisfaction crossing his face as he signaled to the uniformed officers waiting in the foyer. Arthur stepped into the center aisle, looking up at the man he had raised, seeing only the hollow shell of an architect who had forgotten how to build anything of substance. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "You always said I was stuck in the past, Julian," he said, his voice steady as stone. "But in the past, we built things to last. You built a lie and I just pulled the pin. You didn't want my legacy. Now you won't even have your own." Arthur turned his back on the podium, the sound of Julian's frantic, stuttering excuses beginning to rise behind him. He walked toward the exit, his steps firm on the marble floor, leaving the wreckage of his son's ambition to be picked apart by the wolves in the room. He had spent his life reinforcing structures, but today, the most satisfying work he'd ever done was the demolition. The silence that followed the heavy thud of the ballroom doors was more absolute than the noise that had preceded it. For a heartbeat, the air in the sterling foundation's gala hall seemed to thin, leaving the 100-odd guests gasping in a vacuum of shock. At the center of the wreckage stood Julian, still gripping the sides of the mahogany podium, as if it were the only thing keeping him from floating away into the abyss his father had just opened beneath his feet. Julian's skin didn't just pale. It turned a sickly, translucent gray, like parchment left in the rain. His jaw worked soundlessly, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that betrayed the cool facade he'd spent years cultivating. The sweat began as a fine sheen and quickly turned into heavy droplets that tracked through his foundation, carving visible lines of ruin down his cheeks. His eyes, usually sharp with a predatory glint, darted frantically around the room, finding no purchase, no ally, only the cold, mirrored reflection of his own deceit. He looked smaller, the tailored lines of his Italian suit suddenly appearing 3 sizes too large for a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His hands, which had once gestured with the unearned confidence of a king, now gripped the edge of the wood so hard his knuckles turned a bloodless, skeletal white. "It's a fabrication," Julian finally shrieked, the sound cracking in the cavernous room. He looked toward the front row, his voice rising in a desperate, ugly register. "My father is 80 years old. He's confused. He's losing his mind. You all saw him. He's senile and vindictive." The guests didn't move. Sarah Jenkins, the chair of the architectural board, didn't offer the sympathetic nod he expected. Instead, she leaned away from him, her silk dress rustling with a sound like dry leaves, as she physically distanced herself from the man she had been praising only 10 minutes prior. Judge Marcus Vane stood slowly, the weight of his black suit adding a funereal gravity to the moment. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at the folder Arthur had left on the edge of the stage. He adjusted his spectacles, the scent of old paper and expensive tobacco clinging to him as he moved. He picked up the documents, his eyes scanning the notarized seals and the bank ledgers that Arthur had meticulously compiled with the help of Detective Elias Thorne. "These aren't the ramblings of a confused mind, Julian," the judge said, his voice a low, resonant boom that silenced the few whispers beginning to stir in the back of the room. "These are structural blueprints of a fraud. I recognize the signatures on the offshore transfer authorizations. They're yours. And more importantly, they are verified by the state auditor's seal." "He's lying," Julian roared, lunging forward to snatch the folder from the judge's hand. Detective Elias Thorne stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains, his hand resting firmly on Julian's chest. The detective didn't need to use force. The sheer presence of a man who had spent 30 years hunting shadows was enough to make Julian recoil. "Don't make this harder on yourself," he said, his voice a calm, metallic rasp. "The digital trail is already in the hands of the DA. We didn't just find the money, Julian. We found the logs where you accessed your father's medical records to alter his prescriptions." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Beatrice Sterling, who had been standing like a statue of ice beside the stage, suddenly took 2 deliberate steps back. She didn't reach out to comfort her husband. She didn't offer a defense. She adjusted the strap of her designer clutch, her eyes cold as she looked at the man she had helped to gaslight. "I had nothing to do with the medical side, Julian," she said, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the hall. "I told you that Arthur was a brilliant man. I told you that you were underestimated him. You—" Julian spun toward her, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You were the one who suggested the sanitarium. You wrote the notes for the doctors." "I did no such thing," she replied, her tone as smooth as the marble floor. "And I certainly won't be dragged down by your incompetence." The betrayal was the final blow. Julian looked around the room, searching for a single face that wasn't filled with disgust or clinical curiosity. He found Sarah Jenkins, who was already whispering to the board's legal counsel. He found the junior associates, who were recording his collapse on their phones, their thumbs flying across screens as they broadcast his ruin to the world in real time. "The board will convene an emergency session immediately," Sarah announced, her voice trembling with the need to protect the firm's reputation. "Julian, you are suspended effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. Your access to all Sterling accounts is being frozen as we speak." "You can't do that." Julian's voice was a ragged sob now. "I built this. I am the face of this company." "No," Judge Marcus Vane said, looking at him with a pity that was far more painful than anger. "You were the shadow. Your father was the foundation, and you've spent your life trying to build a skyscraper on a swamp." Two uniformed security guards appeared at the side of the stage. They didn't use handcuffs, but the way they flanked Julian made the implication clear. As they led him down the stairs, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, no one wanting to be brushed by his sleeve or caught in his wake. The sound of Julian's frantic, stuttering excuses began to fade as he was led toward the service exit, the heavy oak doors groaning as they were pulled shut behind him. The gala was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. Outside, in the cool night air of the foyer, Arthur stood by the fountain, the sound of splashing water a soothing balm after the heat of the ballroom. He didn't look like a man who had just destroyed his son's life. He looked like a man who had finally finished a difficult, necessary renovation. He reached into his pocket and felt the cold, familiar weight of his old drafting compass. The demolition was complete. Now, for the first time in years, he could finally breathe. 6 months had passed since the night the Sterling name was stripped of its gilded veneer and laid bare under the fluorescent lights of a precinct interrogation room. Arthur Sterling stood on the skeletal second floor of the new Oak Creek Community Center, the scent of fresh-cut cedar, and the sharp, alkaline tang of curing concrete filling his lungs. It was a modest project compared to the glass and steel monoliths that had once defined his career, but here, the foundations were honest. He ran a calloused thumb over the brass hinge of his old drafting compass, the metal warm from the afternoon sun. He wasn't building for ego anymore. He was building for a legacy that didn't require a lie to sustain it. Across the city, in a room that smelled of industrial floor wax and stale, burnt coffee, Julian Sterling sat behind a scarred wooden table. The bespoke Italian suits were gone, replaced by a generic navy blazer that hung loosely over his slumped shoulders. He looked older, the arrogance that had once fueled his every step having curdled into a permanent mask of hollow resentment. Beside him, Beatrice Sterling sat in stony silence, her eyes fixed on a jagged crack in the linoleum floor. The woman who had once navigated the city's elite with the precision of a predator now found that without Arthur's fortune to shield her, her social influence had evaporated like mist in a gale. Her hands, once adorned with diamonds that could buy a suburban home, were bare and trembling. Judge Marcus Vane looked down from the bench, his expression as unyielding as the mahogany he sat behind. He shuffled through the final sentencing recommendations, the dry rustle of paper the only sound in the courtroom. Detective Elias Thorne stood near the back, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the proceedings with the quiet, weary satisfaction of a man who had finally seen a long-overdue debt collected. Julian stood when prompted, his voice cracking as he made one last, desperate plea for leniency. He spoke of unfortunate misunderstandings and the pressures of family expectations, his eyes darting toward the empty gallery as if searching for a savior who wasn't coming. In a final, pathetic display of the character Arthur had spent months documenting, Julian tried to point a trembling finger at his wife, claiming he was merely a passenger in her ambitions. The judge didn't even look up from his notes. The evidence provided by the Sterling estate and verified by this court is exhaustive, Mr. Sterling. You didn't just fail as a developer, you failed as a human being. The state's interest is in justice, not the fragile ego of a man who thought his lineage made him untouchable. You will have plenty of time to reflect on your misunderstandings in the state penitentiary. As the bailiff stepped forward, the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed with a finality that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Julian's face went a sickly shade of gray, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but no words came. Beatrice didn't even look at him as he was led away. She was already calculating her own plea deal, her loyalty having died the moment the bank accounts were frozen. Later that evening, Arthur sat in a wicker chair on the small porch of his new home, a modest craftsman-style house on the edge of the city. Cassie Sterling was there, her laughter ringing out as she threw a tennis ball for a golden retriever that bounded across the lawn. She looked healthy, the shadows that had once darkened her young face replaced by the bright, uncomplicated joy of a child who finally felt safe. She was free from the shadow of her father's greed and her mother's cold manipulations. Arthur watched her, a sharp, bittersweet pang of grief tightening in his chest. He had saved the child, but he had lost the son. He had dismantled the rot, but the family house he'd spent 40 years building was gone, reduced to rubble and legal filings. He pulled a small, worn photograph from his pocket, a younger version of himself holding a toddler-aged Julian on a sun-drenched beach. The edges were frayed, the colors fading into sepia. He didn't regret the reckoning. A structural engineer knew better than anyone that you couldn't save a building once the foundation was compromised. You had to be brave enough to tear it down to the red earth and start again, even if you had to do it alone. He looked out toward the horizon, where the sun was dipping below the tree line, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. The demolition was over. The site was clear. For the first time in a decade, Arthur Sterling was no longer a man under siege. He was simply a man at rest.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.